Before we begin this week's show, some quick parish business to attend to. The Week Unwrapped team and I are going to be appearing live on October the 5th as part of the Podcast Live Politics show in central London. For an eminently reasonable sum, you can come and watch a recording of the show where we will be joined by special guest from the For the Many podcast, LBC's Ian Dale. If you fancy coming along to that, and there are loads of other political podcasts to watch on the day as well, visit podcastlive.com, and if you use our code WEEK10 at checkout, you'll get a 10% discount on your ticket price. That's podcastlive.com and the code WEEK10. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 7th of September, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen MPs voting again to block a no-deal Brexit, Huawei accusing the US of cyber attacks, and the death of at least 20 people in the Bahamas at the hands of Hurricane Dorian. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, we have Arion McNicoll, the boss man, Holden Frith, and from our sister site across the pond, theweek.com, Jessica Hullinger. And starting the show this week is Arion. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week that the health claims about vaping went up in smoke?
My job as a toxicologist is to make sure products that are out for consumption are safe. And I'm always skeptical when there's a new product on the market without any kind of regulation. That's what I've been doing for many, many years, and that's my research passion. The bottom line is, e-cigarettes are not without health effects. They're changing the respiratory mucosa as compared to an otherwise healthy, non-smoking, non-vaping person. And they're changing it in a different way than what we know cigarette smoking does. How this manifests or how this results into long-term diseases, we don't know. All we know is they're not without health effects.
Dr. Ilona Jaspers from the University of North Carolina talking on their YouTube channel, UNC Healthcare. Vaping, she says there, Arion, not without health effects. What might those health effects be?
Well, this week, a second person in the US has died in just a handful of weeks of a severe lung illness that came about after they had vaped. It's being tied to a spate of vaping-related illnesses, or at least lung illnesses that are affecting people who are coming into hospitals saying that they are heavy vapors. And so far, there's around 200 people admitted in hospitals around the US, and it's really unclear what's causing it. The previous person who died was an adult in Illinois, and this new death this week was a person in Oregon. We haven't really heard very many details apart from that about who they are, but yes, the thing that is the uniting factor between all of the people who are unwell and the people who are dying is vaping.
And obviously, it's horrible to have a lung-based condition because of something you've done as a habit, as a recreational thing. But, people will say, well, compared to smoking, 2 deaths in the USA, a very litigious country, they're looking for deaths from vaping, so they've got someone to sue. It's a big industry. This is a price worth paying?
Certainly the NHS continues to advise that vaping is probably better for you than smoking, and they still advocate it as a way of quitting smoking. But I think that the thing that has been a concern on people's minds for a long time is that we just don't know the full effects of vaping. And the thing that has been said for a long time is that we particularly don't know the long-term effects, but here we have some very direct short-term effects, which seems to be related to some particular thing that may be going around. But at least we need more information.
Yeah, and Jess, the shocking thing as well is the age of the victims. I saw in reports that they haven't been specific, but a demographic range was given as something like from 20 to 38 or something. So basically a young person. I mean, the thing about lung conditions from smoking is you tend to be in your 60s plus when it affects you. This is something you could be doing and then drop down dead pretty soon afterwards.
Right, yeah. I mean, a lot of the patients are in their sort of late teens, 20s, 30s, very, very young. And I find that really concerning. And also what shocks me is how quickly a lot of these illnesses come on. So you hear stories about people driving down the road and vaping, and suddenly they just can't breathe. And they have to go into hospital in order to have it treated. So it's not something that comes on over time. It's something that happens immediately, and there's no sort of warning sign. And then they go into the hospital and they have x-rays taken and various tests done. They have the symptoms that appear to be a bacterial or viral infection, but there isn't one. And the doctors, I just find it baffling that they don't know exactly what's causing it.
Holden.
And I think there's a few different theories about what is causing these problems, one of which is a general problem or a general potential problem with legitimate vaping fluids, which are a mixture of whatever the active ingredient is and some kind of oil-based solvent, which is believed to be safe when it is fully vaporized and it's breathed in and it's sort of absorbed through the lungs. But where it can be risky is when the vaping pen is cooling down and it starts to turn back to liquid, and then you get these little droplets of oil which lodge in the lungs and start to cause problems. But I think the other theory is a suspicion that this might not be commercially available vaping fluids that have been used, and they are either some sort of bootleg or some kind of cannabis-based product that people are sort of mixing up themselves or buying from sources who haven't gone through the legitimate process. And so that's introducing another layer of risk.
And here you see, Arion, where this story might be complex because, you've chosen this as your story of the week, and my immediate thought was, well, for all the tobacco companies that have pivoted to e-cigarettes and vaping, this is going to be the moment that this became bad news for them. This is going to be the moment where they're going to have to pivot away and think there are health risks. But actually, bearing in mind what Holden just said, it could be the opposite, couldn't it? This could be the moment they double down and say, we need more regulation so that you only buy our products, which are, at the moment, proven to be safe.
It could be, and definitely big tobacco got involved in this market quite early on, and a lot of the original smaller companies that were trying to dabble in releasing products of their own quickly got smashed by some of the bigger players who have entered more recently. But I think that they're going to struggle to mount that argument that their product is safe when other products are not. Partially because we still don't know, that there is this indication that at least the Oregon case person had smoked or vaped something that contained THC, the marijuana derivative, but he'd bought it from a legitimate store. And so, we have to take that bootleg thing off the table. And also we do know that a lot of people are messing with their vape sticks and they're heating it so that you can get extra vapor out of it so they can blow bigger clouds. And, people are doing all sorts of things with their vapes that are changing the format. But again, we still don't know whether it's that's causing the problem. And there was this really concerning thing from Dr. Ann Thomas, who is the pediatrician who's leading the Oregon incident management team. And she said, at this point, we'd say we really don't know what's safe.
And you talk about pediatrics. I mean, when we last talked about vaping on the podcast, episode 70, if you want to go back and listen to it, it was about how Juul, the brand, is basically being marketed at teenagers in the US and how regulations aren't there, like there are regulations around traditional cigarettes. Do you think, Jess, that might change?
Yeah, I don't know if it will change. I think it certainly should. I think that there should certainly be regulations on selling these kinds of things to kids. And I think that the sort of fancy, sweet flavorings that are being sold, Fruit Loops, whatever, I think that's a little bit silly. And I don't really know how you could justify that. I also think it's worth noting that vaping is being spun as a way to quit smoking. But there's research that shows that people who intend to quit smoking and use vaping as a way to do it, they still smoke. A lot of people do both. And there's also research that shows that vaping, it can lead to smoking. So with that in mind, I think especially if young people are doing it, it's very concerning if it turns them later into smokers.
The anti-tobacco campaigners feel as though they were making such inroads into smoking and finally getting people to quit. And then vaping came along and all of those arguments have been undone. And the argument for vaping is this sort of unknown that we kind of think it's safe, so you just go ahead and vape and you'll probably be okay. But their argument at the time was, how about we just don't inhale nicotine because we know that it's been bad in one format and it looks like we just don't have enough evidence on this to make those kinds of claims yet. So let's cool it on the advice side.
And that's the extraordinary thing about this product category, isn't it, Holden? There are no positives to inhaling nicotine. We don't know whether there are long-term or even short-term health effects. We've only had a few deaths, but we know it's definitely not a good thing.
There was a fairly recent study published in the British Medical Journal, which came to that really awkward issue of the fact that smoking tobacco is such a bad thing that doing almost anything is better than that. But doctors, researchers are really unwilling or really uncomfortable pushing people towards a solution which may itself have deep problems. And nicotine is in itself a health risk, even if it's not surrounded by carcinogenic smoke. But if you look at it as a simple casualty reduction policy, then there's no question that you should be moving people away from smoking tobacco products and towards vaping instead.
Do we think that there's the same level of kind of cover-up that there was around cancer-causing tobacco, though? Because you can sort of look back at that stuff and think, oh, when doctors were prescribing cigarettes and, Formula One was being sponsored by tobacco companies, there was no alternative voice telling everyone this is killing you. But now with the internet, actually, if you're interested in the health pros and cons, you just Google it. It's all there. It's your decision as an adult. If we stop sale to children.
A case like we've seen this week, and in fact, the summer that the US has experienced that has seen so many vapors admitted to hospital with this very unclear set of symptoms that so far they really don't know how to treat. I think that would be the reason why you'd advise people to be cautious. I don't know that big tobacco or whatever they're going to become, big vape, have yet undertaken mass information campaigns or at least advertising campaigns that are too much trying to promote safety as one of the things that is a recommending feature. But if the NHS is doing that for you, you don't really need to. There's not a cover-up that's begun because so far that work is being done by the health services.
And finally, I'm just curious on the sort of business case for vaping and vaping startups and companies investing in vaping. If you take the ethical and moral side away from it and you're just a hard-nosed investor who wants a return, bearing in mind these deaths that are coming through, is this still an industry you'd want to be investing in? Are we still going to see growth in vaping?
I think it will depend on whether these turn out to be the full extent of the problem or if this is the first sign of greater problems to come. And it is a relatively small number of people, and all sorts of products cause casualties. In 1999, 37 people were hospitalized after accidents involving tea cozies. And every year, more than 8,000 people, more seriously, are injured by cotton buds. Everybody knows the warnings of what you should and shouldn't do with cotton buds, and yet 8,000 people a year do what they shouldn't do and injure themselves. So I think that, it is clearly a serious problem, but is it a very small serious problem that people will just accept as one of the risks of a fully lived life, or is it part of a problem that will really put people off what has been seen, I think, until now as an entirely harmless and, in fact, perhaps a life-extending practice if you're doing that instead of smoking?
Okay, Holden, you're up next after this.
Order! The Prime Minister will be aware that Podcast Live Politics will return to London on Saturday, October 5th.
Indeed, I imagine people in this house will enjoy seeing Chopper's Brexit podcast and the Delling pod, whilst the Honourable Gentleman will no doubt enjoy seeing Polling Politics to see how badly he and his party are doing.
Typical Tory bluster. I believe the Prime Minister would benefit from seeing the new European podcast, UK in a Changing Europe, and to think about Ian Dale and Jackie Smith's For the Many.
Order! Whether the House wishes to see talking politics or escape Brexit with the Week Unwrapped, there will be plenty of room for everyone. Even the Liberal Democrats can see never mind the bar charts. And all of these podcasts are live in London on October 5th. Indeed, tickets are available now from podcastlive.com. Unlock!
Yes, and if you missed my announcement at the top of the show, we are very subtly reminding you in this manner that The Week Unwrapped is appearing at Podcast Live Politics on October the 5th in central London with special guest Ian Dale. Get your tickets now at podcastlive.com. Right, back to the show now. And Holden, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
It may be time we all turn Japanese in the bathroom.
This video is going to be a little bit different. It is a not your typical travel adventure video, although I am traveling. I'm on a 12-hour layover in Tokyo, Japan. I'm at the airport, and I just thought I would show you exactly how interesting, fascinating, and fantastic the bathroom facilities are. This is probably the best part. All of these features, you've got you've got the bidet, which is, popular all over Europe. Americans find it quite, excessive. And then warm air that you can dry yourself with after you bidet, which is nice. That's not something you see in Europe. And that's kind of the reason when I'm in Europe, or all Americans when we're in Europe, I think for the most part, we're kind of like, okay, this bidet, what do we do once we're all wet after? This is a little bit, yeah.
That was YouTuber AMATV and their video Japanese Toilets / Tokyo Airport Adventure. Watch out, HBO. Holden, why are Japanese toilets in the news?
Well, this is more of a gradual shift than a single event. But what alerted me to it was 2 articles published in the last few days. One in Forbes about American toilet habits and another on wired.co.uk about the same topic in both the US and Europe. And what both identified was essentially that Westerners are now much more enthusiastic about Japanese-style toilets with sprays and air jets and all sorts of entertainment options too, and that they're starting to install these in their own homes.
Okay, and are there stats to back this up? This isn't just a kind of anecdotal, or there are a few startups doing Japanese toilets.
That's right. Every year since 2009, sales of Toto's Japanese-style toilets have been doubling. So obviously that's starting from a fairly low base, but it has reached the level now where they have sales offices in the UK, France and Germany. Germany is apparently the most enthusiastic market for these toilets, but the UK is second behind them.
Okay. And bearing in mind, this is the week where, as we record, I'm not even sure we have a government. Why is this your story of the week? Why is this a significant moment? I mean, so what if people get some Japanese toilets?
Well, I think it's an area that people are very reluctant, or at least have been very reluctant to talk about, and also very reluctant to change their habits. You tend to have very distinct national styles of bathroom. And if people...
Okay, but so what? I mean, what does it matter?
Well, one of the reasons this matters is that the production of toilet paper requires huge amounts of paper. And in fact, Britons consume more toilet paper per person than any other nationality in the world.
In 20 years, America's toilet paper use has destroyed a portion of a forest in Canada that's the size of Ohio, so that's about 28 million acres. And this forest holds a lot of the world's carbon. So yeah, our toilet paper use is potentially destroying the planet. And so with the idea of a, quote, shower toilet not requiring us to use toilet paper is actually a really interesting idea, I think, and could have huge environmental impacts. But also, I think it's worth noting that modern toilets haven't really seen a lot of redesign in a very, very long time. The flush toilet has been the same for over, a century. A lot of them are quite wasteful as well. And one of the benefits of this type of toilet that the retailer promotes is that it actually helps save some water. So I think the larger point, while this may seem to a lot of people as kind of gimmicky, I think that we should be open to the idea of changing the toilet just generally.
I mean, this technology has always existed as well, hasn't it, Arion? Isn't it known basically as a bidet? Aren't these companies that are coming along doing Japanese-style toilets just effectively doing the Impossible Burger did for vegan burgers, doing that for bogs, aren't they? They're just saying, well, here's the thing that's always existed. We're going to make it sound sexy. It's a Japanese shower toilet.
I mean, I'm not sure the bidet has always existed,
Sure.
but certainly it's been around for a long time.
It's been a while since I read Genesis.
I looked back to see how some of the prehistory of toilet behavior was conducted, and the ancient Greeks were using pottery shards, apparently, to clean themselves up, which
Jessica is grimacing.
Doesn't sound nice. Apparently, you would also sometimes engrave the name of your enemy on the pottery shard before using it, which I kind of liked. In ancient Rome, people cleaned themselves up using a sea sponge that was lashed to a stick and then doused in either seawater or vinegar to clean it up. But apparently toilet paper itself was only invented around the 6th century in China. And so I think the other thing that makes this story significant is the hygiene aspect, that, that we're seeing potentially hygiene move on, because there just is something a bit icky about putting your hand down there after you've been to the loo. And this does eradicate that.
I think one theory as to why these toilets are starting to catch on now is that more people are travelling to Japan and other areas of Southeast Asia, or to international hotel chains that cater to Japanese tourists and therefore install these toilets wherever they happen to be in the world. And people are just finding that it's a better system and that they want to live like this.
Yeah, and it started out as a curiosity, like that clip that we heard at the top of this section. But actually, I think people are more okay with it and they're willing to give it a try. And the singing, spraying toilet doesn't seem so weird anymore.
And there's a reason we shower in water and not in paper.
Right.
But there's also the simplicity of some of these startups and what they do, because you can retrofit a spray onto your toilet, can't you, onto a Western toilet, whereas a lot of the companies before, if you wanted a Japanese-style toilet in your house, you'd need to find a plumber who could install it. Maybe you'd have to get it exported from Japan. I mean, that's gone now a bit.
Yeah, and some of those are really expensive, like several £1,000s, whereas the simpler attachments just fit under the existing seat and cost between sort of £50 and £100.
What I find interesting as well is a statistic I read that said that 40% of sales for one of the companies making these toilets go to elderly or disabled consumers. So I think it's worth noting that if you don't have the sort of movability that a lot of people have, it can be difficult to use toilet paper at all and to properly clean up. And so to not have to and to give these people, the ability to just be more comfortable, I think is really important.
I think it's also interesting as a story just questioning one of those things that we just don't tend to ever look at. We just sort of think, well, that's the way you go to the loo and that's the way it's always going to be. But actually doing a bit of research around this topic, I discovered all sorts of ways that we're apparently doing it wrong, including apparently...
Holden set a very high bar for factoids in the last story.
Yeah, okay, well, so here's my factoid, that apparently squatting is the best position to poo in. And apparently if you can get yourself into, with your hip flexed at 60 degrees in respect to the rest of your body, with the legs flexing at 22.5 degrees, that is the optimal position to be going to the loo.
But optimal, why? Because it avoids bowel cancers and stuff like that.
Exactly that. And same thing with weeing for men. If you're going to urinate, the best way to do it is also sitting down, because you completely clear out your system and avoid health-related problems.
There are parts of the world where it has been more traditional to squat on sort of open pan toilets, where even when a Western-style toilet is installed, people will squat on the seat. And you then often in hotels see signs warning people against squatting and say you must keep your feet on the floor at all times.
So if here at Dennis Publishing they decide to take out all of the Armitage shanks and replace them with these super-duper Japanese toilets, would you be impressed?
Yeah, squatting all over.
Would you take your business elsewhere?
Have you guys ever used one of these toilets?
No, I haven't.
I have.
Okay.
One of them is installed in a friend of mine's house in Connecticut.
Okay, there's a note of, insecurity in your voice here. Are you saying...
No insecurity, no. I'm just saying, so the only feature that I used there was the heated seat. Amazing.
Right, okay. Oh, no, I thought you were going to be cynical. Okay, fine. So you're all on team Japanese toilet.
I'm on board, man. I'm on board.
Okay, well, hopefully the bosses are listening. Who needs a pay rise? Jessica, your story, which is the equivalent of a heated toilet seat for this podcast, it's a balming final story, is up after this. And so finally this week, it's Jessica. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This is the week we realized that Ted is kind of a jerk.
Like it or not, diversity is not really a problem for business yet. I mean, it's a nice thing to have. It's the right thing to do. But for decades, we've been trying to make the case that diversity fuels innovation and customer insight. I mean, at this point, it's kind of a no-brainer. A little bit like hearing a smoke alarm going off and standing there with your hand on the hot door waiting for some data to tell you that your house is on fire. Because the data is already there. Ethnically diverse companies perform 33% better than the norm. Forbes' best workplaces for diversity enjoy 24% higher revenue growth. And yet, here we are in 2018, and there are only 3 Black CEOs in the Fortune 500.
That was a clip from Janet Stovall's TED Talk called How to Get Serious About Diversity and Inclusion in the Workplace. That's available to stream now. And Jessica, your story is about diversity and inclusion in TED itself.
Yeah, that's right. So a study came out this week from the Political Research Exchange Journal finding that women and racial minorities are vastly underrepresented on the TED stage. So the researchers studied more than 2,000 TED Talks and 1.2 million YouTube comments, and they found that more than half of TED Talks are given by white men. Just 1/3 of speakers are women, and 80% of speakers are white. And on top of that, talks dealing with the topic of inequality and diversity, as the clip we just heard, and those represented by female speakers are more likely to get more negative feedback on YouTube. So people don't like them.
All right. I mean, there's obviously two parts to this then. Let's park the business about the reaction from the audience for a moment, because we're talking about primarily, I guess, TED's responsibility as an organization to reflect diversity. Do you think this is a problem for them? Do you think the people at TED are going to see this research and think, we desperately need to get more people of colour on our stage as soon as possible? Or do you think they'll have a defence for this?
They do have a defence for this. They have said on their website that they are doing everything they can to reach out to people who are underrepresented and get more people on their stage. But I think that you have to take into consideration that the process for getting on the TED stage is quite opaque. It's quite mysterious. You don't know exactly how people are chosen. And so there's no sort of clear way that people are nominated. I mean, you can nominate someone, but there's no guarantee that that person will get in. So I think there are a couple of possible reasons for the disparities. One is a general lack of representation in the field of science and tech, right? So the STEM field in general is lacking in women and people of color. Men dominate that field, and women of color earn the smallest share of STEM degrees. But I also think that there's a lot to be said for the fact that this is an unpaid role, right? So like in order to get on the TED stage, you have to rehearse, you have to audition, you have to write your speech, you have to spend a lot of time getting it up to snuff. And if you don't have the time, or if you earn less money, which women, and particularly women of color, do, it can be really hard to make all of that happen. So I think that there's that aspect as well.
Although, I mean, this is a horrible context in which to mansplain anything, but from my reading of the data recently, the women issue isn't a problem anymore. TED actually have, I think, more than 50% of their speakers in the last year were women. So it's specifically about ethnic diversity, isn't it, where they've still got an issue?
Right. So in the first half of 2017, more women than men gave TED Talks. So the researchers do point out that the numbers for women are improving, but the statistics for people of color have not improved at all.
Holden, does it matter from a listener and a viewer's perspective? I mean, the point about TED is to bring interesting and diverse ideas to people. You're not supposed to be looking at the ethno background or age or gender or anything of the speaker and deducing anything from that. You're supposed to be listening to what they're proposing, the ideas they're bringing you.
I think that there's probably two areas which could be a problem there. And one is that the ideas are meant to be diverse. And if you're only drawing them from a narrow subset of the population, you're going to be reflecting a narrow subset of potential ideas. And those may be geographical, they may be social, they may be cultural, but either way, you're just not getting a full sense of the breadth of innovation out there. But also the second side is that it could end up reinforcing the idea that ideas do come from a kind of older, whiter, maler, academic kind of world that isn't necessarily the case when you cast your net more broadly.
I suppose the danger, Arion, is that in the areas that TED's interested in, those ideas often do come from older white men because of all sorts of systemic changes that have yet to evolve. And, you know, as we heard in the clip that we just played, the speaker there herself saying whatever small percentage it was of CEOs are black, you know, if they're looking for top grade speakers, they really would have to look in different places to broaden that range.
And also TED stands for Technology, Entertainment, Design. And I looked into those three fields particularly. All of them are fields that have diversity problems. Tech, for example, especially so, where less than 7% of positions in Europe are filled by women. Within the film industry, 3% of employees are from minority ethnic backgrounds, and just 1 in every 5 key production personnel are women. You see the same thing in design, and you see the same thing in music. And I think that obviously TED has actually broadened its sphere of interest from those three fields since it began in the 80s. But you're still drawing from fields that themselves have diversity problems. And so I think that is a problem, an ongoing problem.
And do you think correcting that, Jessica, would actually address the other part of the story that you brought in? You know, that there's trolling, effectively, of women and ethnic minorities more than there is of white male speakers. That if there was a broader range of speakers, there'd be a less reactive commentariat?
I don't know if that's the case. I think it's the right thing to do, but I don't think that it would shut down the trolls. I think that, you know, especially when you talk about these people are talking about inequality and trying to improve diversity, a lot of the viewers, and particularly the people who attend TED, I think are older, white men. And those are the people who benefit probably most from the current status quo. And if you are talking about an idea that would upend that, I think that it is likely that you will just have a knee-jerk reaction to not wanting to see the status quo change if it currently benefits you. So I don't know if it would correct that, even though I wish that it would.
Although, I mean, you're right to say that the people in the room spending thousands of dollars on a ticket probably are from a pretty high-status proportion of North America, essentially. But the whole idea of TED, in fairness to it, is a democratic platform to reach people for free on YouTube that can be, you know, enlightened by lectures they otherwise wouldn't have had access to. I mean, in spirit, that's quite a broad and inclusive idea.
Sure, yeah. I think in spirit, it's a very broad and inclusive idea. But I think if what you're putting out there into the world is not broad or inclusive, it kind of cancels out.
I think the other way in which TED, for all its good intentions, and I really admire the spirit of it, but I often find individual talks quite irritating, and they're irritating in the same way. There's actually a sort of lack of diversity of approach or concept to a lot of the talks that get said. So they seem to reward an approach that values narrative above all else and clarity over doubt and uncertainty, and really a supreme self-confidence amongst the speakers. And I think that perhaps is related to, perhaps those qualities are more often found amongst men than women, but also they're found amongst a particular subset of men. And so you tend to get you find those qualities amongst business leaders, amongst politicians, amongst scientists who are good at being politicians or business people, much more than you do amongst those who are at the coalface of research and those who are kind of sifting through much more complex problems.
Worth noting that one of the ways that you can get onto TED stage is by nominating yourself.
Do I sense something of a backlash against TED then? I mean, they've had a pretty good run for the last decade, haven't they? Do you think the general public are beginning to be a bit cynical about them?
Yeah, I think that the longer TED is around, the more sort of skeptical people become of a lot of the talks, and especially because there have been examples of speakers and talks that have been hugely popular, but have been later criticized by the research and science world. So, for example, the second most popular TED Talk ever, which received more than 53 million views, comes from a social psychologist named Amy Cuddy, and it's called Your Body Language May Shape Who You Are. And it's all about how, quote, power poses can make you a more confident person, make you feel more powerful.
Oh, was this when we saw politicians all standing in A-frames everywhere?
Yeah, politicians, people interviewing for jobs, going to the bathroom, do big, movements. And her theory, presented by some of her research, was that if you made yourself big, that you would be a more powerful, confident person. And this was hugely popular, but it didn't take long for the science community to say, wait a minute, this data doesn't really add up, and they poked a lot of holes in it. So she received a lot of backlash. She's since come back with more research saying, no, this is legit, but it's not the only example of TED Talks being sort of wishy-washy. And also, it's not clear to me in the research that I did that anyone really fact checks or vets the research and the presentations that people do. As you're watching a TED Talk, I think it's worth taking everything with a grain of salt.
Okay, thank you for that, Jess. And thank you as well to Holden and Arion. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. You should make sure you hear each week from our entirely exclusive panel when you subscribe to this podcast. Make a power pose now and do it through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get yours. And remember to rate and review the show as well. That helps other people discover us. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week. Bye-bye.